Everyone, welcome to our lecture video this week. This is week 3, and in corrections, we are talking specifically the types of inmates that we encounter in this profession. So, real quick, in case you didn't see, the updated calendar does have all the correct readings. So this week, it's what we're talking about here in this lecture is chapters 3, 8, and 9 of our first text, the one textbook, and then unit 4 of the other textbook. And so, really, and this is as straightforward as possible, really what we're talking about is just the different types of inmates this week. So we're not getting into, policies and things like that, but we are going to be talking about these different particular groups of inmates and individuals that one sees in corrections, especially talking about unique groups, because right off the bat, so obviously we're looking at the various types slide. So I have it broken down. Here are the larger sections that we're going to look at. We're looking at juveniles and adults are the two biggest categories. Obviously, juveniles are a separate system, and so if you've taken juvenile justice, you already know a decent amount about this. So we are going to talk briefly about how juveniles work in corrections, but adults are really the rest of the general population. So we'll talk about that, but there are various subgroups under adults. We have, and these also go for the juveniles as well, but obviously the LGBTQIA plus community, these individuals are something we need to talk about. Non-citizens, the elderly, female offenders, because on top of, we'll talk about trans women and trans men and that issue when we talk about the LGBTQIA plus, but female offenders, there are different requirements based solely off of the biological functions of a female body versus a male body, and some unique circumstances that they will experience that others won't, particularly pregnancy, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the mentally unwell. We'll talk about gang members, because gangs are something that needs to be discussed. And then career criminals and what that actually looks like. So we will start off by briefly going over juveniles. And so juvenile offenders, overall, juveniles account for 17% of all violent offenses in the United States. So when I say all 17% of all violent offenses, this is the data for adult and juveniles across the board. 17% of all violent offenses are committed by a juvenile individual, someone who is under the legal age of 18. And in the same boat, 26% of all property offenses are committed by juveniles. In case you need reminded, violent offenses are the particular crimes like aggravated assault, homicide, robbery, especially with a weapon, that kind of thing. And property offenses are really, we talk about them as more lesser crimes. They're not as severe. These are things like theft, burglary, robbery, damaging property, things like that. So property offenses, and it is a bit of a stereotype to think about it, but typically there is a strong association with juvenile delinquency and theft, petty theft, shoplifting, things like that. So it makes sense that they account for a higher percentage than violent offenses regarding that, but there is a general issue regarding this that needs to be stated, and it's something that's stated in juvenile justice, but it's important here. The percentages shown here, it is disproportionately high for the size of the community. So obviously, juvenile delinquents, if they are, this large of a percentage of these particular crimes, their total population for arrest is not that high. So they're disproportionately represented for committing certain crimes. So it's something to keep in mind, that these numbers, I know we use percentages a lot and things like that, and it's a difficult thing for us to kind of understand and visualize just how much that actually is. So just know that they are definitely, they're overrepresented, um, but there's more to it than that. And so something that's also important to note and that makes juveniles a particularly different and focused group is the fact that they are still developing. Physically and mentally, they are not adults. Specifically because their minds and their mental health, it is in this developing process. Um, there's a large use of cognitive behavioral therapy use in juvenile delinquency, as far as corrections and following a rehab model. Again, if you've taken juvenile justice, you'll know this. If not, this is just kind of your little intro to this. One of the key goals of the juvenile system is to rehabilitate the juvenile, to essentially get them on the right track to become a full functioning member of society when they're an adult. And so, obviously, because they're developing, because that's the goal, cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of different therapies, particularly things that focus on the individual, and the argument can be made about nurture versus nature, but really, juvenile offenders are a particular unique group of offenders in how they are treated and operated, and how we work with them with the idea of returning them to society at large. And so, again, the main goal of specifically juvenile corrections, juvenile courts, is to teach the juvenile the right thing to do, the right course of action, and to correct them onto that path so that they become fully functioning members of society. That's part of the reason why juvenile records tend to be sealed uh, from background checks and things like that, simply because it shouldn't prevent you from doing something. So, because of all this in mind, and as I said, the different way that the system operates, so the facilities vary widely from place to place. This can be in the rules and the goals that they have for their individual inmates. This can be in the operations, like whether they have particular time schedules where inmates are locked away or get exercise, things like that. What kind of schooling looks like for that situation, what education's available. This can be also in, obviously, name. One thing that's important to note is there are a bunch of different facilities. Ownership is a big thing with juvenile facilities in particular. There are public facilities. These are the things that are like run by the state and everything, but there are private facilities for juvenile delinquency where maybe individuals in government have some kind of connection to it, but the idea is that these are independently run and approved by the state or whatever to operate as a juvenile rehabilitation facility or things like that. But so the names can be ranches, boot camps, camp, facility is one term. Like, the names really do vary widely. And it kind of depends on where geographically it is and what they're trying to put forward as their goal. Wilderness camps are something that fall under this as well. It's just important to note that because of the special emphasis on rehabilitating a juvenile delinquent, the facilities then take on a different role. And instead of having, a fairly straightforward design based off of state requirements for correctional facilities. The private sector can vary very, very, very widely different from each other. So it's just important to note. Something else to note is that juveniles within the criminal justice system as a whole have very similar rights as adult offenders. Obviously, because they are not solely autonomous, they are not recognized as adults on their own and things like that. They have parents, guardians, whatever it may be. Obviously, they have certain protections that require those individuals to be involved or at least attempted to be contact. Our text does talk about specifics of juveniles who are detained and arrested and requirements to contact parents. But another big difference with the rights that they have that adult offenders have, or rather something that juveniles don't have that adult offenders have, is the right to a jury of your peers. Almost all, I would say, with the exception of the individual cases where this is a wonderful, if you took juvenile justice, you know this. Unless a juvenile is tried as an adult, so they get a particular attainder, a writ of attainder to charge them as an adult. If they are a juvenile, they do not have a trial by jury. They have a trial by a judge. They're usually private courts where the judge is the one that hears the argument of the state and the argument of the defense, which is the juvenile, and will make a sentence there based off of what they heard, rather than having a jury of your peers hear out everything, all the evidence, and then make a recommendation. So that's a big difference between juveniles and, as far as like constitutional rights between juveniles and adult offenders. Adult offenders, you have the right to a trial by jury of your peers. Juveniles don't have that. Partly because a jury of their peers would be other kids, and you can't really force kids to do jury duty. It's a whole thing. But so it's just important to note that. So this is an amalgamation quote from our text. I just want to cover some of the big statistic things that I wanted to emphasize because it is important. But more than 60% of justice-involved youth experience trauma within the first 5 years of life. And then approximately 1/3 of justice-involved youth, so that's that 60%, approximately a third of that total have experienced multiple traumas. And so we will talk about it a little bit when we talk about mental health, but trauma is complicated and difficult. If you know anything about psychology, you know that trauma affects the human brain in very different ways. People respond to trauma in different ways, and the fact that the data shows that a majority of individuals who are connected in and involved in some way with justice, and particularly, an officer has talked to them, arrested them, things like that, within the first 5 years of their existence, they had trauma. And about a third of that had more than one trauma. That's a lot. That does impact a person's development, especially when you look at a child of 5 years or younger and you're experiencing multiple traumas. That will severely affect your growth and your worldview. And so it's important to note that while we don't have definitive answers for everything, understanding that a lot of juvenile delinquents have experienced some sort of early life trauma might help us in understanding how we could treat better, and understanding trauma better. And so the last thing I want to talk about with juveniles in particular is status offenses, delinquency, and dependency. So I've been talking a lot about delinquency so far. Delinquency is just the committing of crimes by a juvenile. That's straightforward. That is just what we've been talking about the whole time. We call them a juvenile delinquent instead of a juvenile criminal because, well, that term is a little bit better. Status offenses, again, if you've taken juvenile justice, you know what this is. If you have not, this is something that will be talked about in that class. But status offenses are crimes that are only crimes because the individual is a juvenile. These are things like curfew violations, truancy, petty infractions, things like this. You don't go to school, that's truancy, that's a crime, but it's not really a crime because if you were an adult and you decided not to go to your college class, do you get in trouble and get a officer sent to you? No, you're an adult. You can do whatever the heck you want. Status offenses are only crimes because you are a juvenile, because you are a child. So it's important to note that there are some issues with crime reports and data simply because there are status offenses. And so these are different. So sometimes the percentage of juveniles who are involved with the law, sometimes it's the property offenses and violent offenses, sometimes it's just status offenses. So the data, it's important to note that there is a difference. But we talk about delinquency, and our text does a good job of talking about dual status. And dual status, there might be individuals who are within the juvenile justice system and the corrections, and they may be delinquent, but they might be there because of dependency. And dependency is exactly what it sounds like. It depends. The individual is dependent on something. And so what dependency is talking about is when a parent or legal guardian or whomever it may be can no longer care for the juvenile. And there's a whole process for it. And the book does a really good job of talking about, in particular, dependency and all these kinds of issues. But when an individual cannot be cared for, there are state systems, there are systems in place everywhere to help take care of them. And one of them that you may be aware of, it's the one that most people know about, and that's foster care. The foster care system in America is... I'm going to preface this by saying this is not just my opinion. This is something that there's a lot of data behind, and if you're interested, I'd be glad to find some particular articles and share with you. But the foster care system in the United States is extremely flawed in its current application. The goal of the foster care system is to reconnect children with their parents when they can care for them again. The idea of this is that dependency, the parent can no longer care for the child, so the child needs to be taken care of by someone else until the parent can prove they can take their child again and take care of them. So the goal of foster care is supposed to be for that, but that isn't always what happens. And foster care is supposed to be, positive situations, but there are people that abuse that system, that don't care for the children in the way that they're supposed to. There's a lot of issues with foster care. If you are interested in this, please feel free to reach out to me. I will put you in touch with some data and books and things of that nature that will help put more light on the foster system. That's not to say that the foster system is not good. There are positive stories and situations that come out of foster care, but it's not always. So it's just important to note that we're talking about dependency. This is the foster system. But in general, juveniles enter this system as a result of parental neglect or abuse. It's not because the juvenile just wants to. It's there's a reason for being in this situation. And then obviously there are larger care facilities. There are individual people who are foster parents, so they're private citizens that welcome them into their homes. So when I say that juveniles as a group of inmates and whatnot within the juvenile justice, well, within the criminal justice system, are unique, this is what I mean. There are so many different levels to juvenile justice in particular. That's why we have a separate class, why we talk about it when there's a separate system for them, because there are all these other factors that play in. So let's shift gears, and we're now going to the adults, but we're going to talk about some of the marginalized groups and things of that nature first. So we're going to talk about the LGBTQIA plus community. So something that is important to note, and it's specifically relevant to the transgender community. Several locations and facilities across the United States, not just in one state or another, but across the United States, they use sex-based placement for trans inmates. And what this means is that it's not gender identity, but biological sex organs. So if you have a vagina, you are placed in a women's prison system. If you have a penis, you are placed in the male prison system. That is point blank where it is. This does cause an issue, not only the personal issue of not my gender, that's not how I feel, but there's some very interesting data about this that's also related to the LGB part as well, and that's the next thing. The available data in the book does give this for us straightforward, and the book uses specifically California because they're big on that particular piece, but this is something that is worth noting. The available data shows that LGBTQ inmates are sexually assaulted at a severely higher rate in prison. They are 13 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than any other inmate. And this is important if you remember sex-based placement. So there are trans inmates, there are trans women who are in male prisons that are 13 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. There are trans men who are in women's prisons who are 13 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. This is an issue of victimized, how do I want to phrase this? This shows a high victimization of an already marginalized community. This is something that we need to consider. Now, there have been some advances. Some places don't use sex-based placement for trans inmates. And sometimes we have specified lockup procedures and things of that nature across the board. So in some places, there might be, for lack of a better word, a trans or gay wing, where individuals, they might be part of a specific community within the facility so that they're not being targeted by other members of the larger prison population. It depends, obviously, on the size of the prison itself, the staffing, the laws of the state, things of that nature. But it's important to note that just in general, the fact that there's a higher rate of sexual assault and violence is not great. But on top of that, there's a fairly high rate of incarceration among the LGBTQIA plus community. And the question is why? And so our textbook gives one issue, but I'm going to bring up another issue as well. And so there is a fairly high rate of incarceration for the LGBTQIA plus community. One thing is that it's exclusion from legal economy that leads to criminal enterprises. In very simple terms, this is they cannot get a job in a legitimate field, so they turn to sex work, drug dealing, stealing, etc. to survive. These are not legal economic ways to succeed. These are technically considered illegal. Prostitution is illegal in everywhere except for Nevada, in particular Las Vegas. I couldn't think of the word for a minute. Drug dealing, and for 99% of it, is illegal. Stealing is illegal. But these things are done to survive because, for whatever reason, they cannot get jobs in legitimate fields. Goes into a deeper, complex, and complicated conversation. But that is one major reason why we see a higher rate of incarceration. And this is something, like I said, the textbook doesn't talk about it, but then again, it also has only fairly recently been studied more and more. Social issues and homelessness within the LGBTQIA plus community is something that definitely is probably, and I'm saying this because I don't have any scientific data or studies to show you that says, yes, social issues and homelessness has led to this. We have to infer, or rather, we should infer based off of how homelessness is treated as a crime, and how these things are classified and all that, and be able to extrapolate that that might have a direct impact. And so, in particular, with the LGBTQIA plus community, there is a decently high rate of homelessness, and this does come from particularly conservative areas where individuals do not feel safe or are no longer welcome in their family home for whatever reason, and so they move out, and sometimes they have enough money to make it for a while, and sometimes they don't. And when you become homeless, you do what you can to survive. And when homelessness is already treated as a crime in a lot of cases, it's difficult to not become intimately related to or intimately connected with the criminal justice system. And so other social issues like protests, as well as ostracization. We've seen several violent actions taken out against members of this community. It is not surprising to see that there is a fairly high rate of incarceration for this group, when there is a lot that socially plays into how this group can survive or operate. So it's just interesting to note that things are almost never as simple as you think they could be or should be. There's always more complicated things. And so to round out the, well, not even rounding out because we still have to talk about female inmates, but to round out one of our last super controversial and hot topic groups to talk about within the United States is non-citizens. So despite being called non-citizens, we're talking about legal and illegal aliens. The idea is that individuals who are within this country who were not born here or may not be yet a legal U.S. citizen. Non-citizens, that's why I say legal and illegal aliens, because there are people who are here that are not U.S. residents, but they are here legally. They're just not returning to their home country yet. They could be students, they could be here on a work visa, things of that nature. They are not U.S. citizens, but they are here legally. A good friend of mine, his girlfriend is actually a legal alien. She is from, I can't remember which province, but she's from southern India, and she's here on a work visa. That is a legal alien. But she would be classified as a non-citizen. She's not a citizen of the United States. And so within the corrections field, within the criminal justice field, non-citizens in particular are heavily stereotyped. data when it comes to arrests. Really, the three main things that play into this stereotype data when we look at arrest records for non-citizens: place of birth, name, and skin color are the three things that stick out. So obviously, skin color, if you don't look like the traditional white person of that area, you may be particularly targeted to see if you are in fact a citizen or not. Obviously, and I will say this right now, because we are in the northeast part of the United States, we share a border with Canada, and Canada is also very European white centric for the most part, not counting the indigenous people who have dealt with a lot of negative hate and destruction by the uh, European Canadians, but that's not a thing for here. Um, we don't share a border with a group of people that look significantly different, and so uh, this is a big issue in our Midwest and far west states. So we're talking about California, Arizona, uh, Texas is the big one. Even Florida on the east end. Like, we're talking about all of these kinds of states that have a large immigration group come in. This is where we see a lot of this data that is heavily stereotyped. This is one of those. It is not accurate, but during former President Donald Trump's 2016 campaign to being elected, uh, reinforced a lot of negative stereotypes about uh, people from Mexico being criminals and illegal aliens that cause more crime. When anyone that has access to the actual data will show you that illegal aliens in general, both illegal and legal people who are not born in the United States or not U.S. citizens, they participate in significantly less crime than anyone else. So just it's an important thing to note. Um, but obviously, in the same vein, the way your name sounds in these areas where this is a big issue, if your name sounds too ethnic, I hate to say it, but that way, but it is. If your name sounds too ethnic, you might be stereotyped and look to see if you are a non-citizen. And then place of birth, obviously, is the big one. If you were not born in the United States, well, then you cannot be a U.S. citizen. So we must get you out of here, despite the fact that you could be a legal U.S. resident who just happened to be born in another country. You could be up for this stereotyping of being a non-citizen, and so it's very complicated, and this is a heavily race-based, stereotype-based problem within the criminal justice field. But in a non, this is a race-based prejudice issue, um, where things get complicated and why we need to talk about it in regards to corrections is ICE. So this is the Immigration Enforcement Group. Um, they're involved with local, state, and federal government simultaneously. So there are, benefits to facilities that house individuals who are non-citizens waiting to either be deported or waiting on paperwork, things of that nature. So there is a kickback for the local area, but they also, the fact that they work with law enforcement is a sticky situation, because that means that they are law enforcement should be arresting people who break crimes or who commit crimes, not detaining people who may or may not be a non-citizen and then handing it over to ICE. That's where this issue comes in. This is where it becomes a very predatory and not okay practice. But because there are illegal aliens, and because there are bad actors, as we'll call them, individuals who commit crime that are part of this group, they will appear in our statistics and our crime data. These will be individuals who are arrested. There will be some who are falsely arrested and imprisoned, but it's important to note that this population is unique, especially when cases and individuals can be handed over directly just to ICE. And so instead of being part of the state or national arrest record, they might just be another individual who is deported or detained in a different kind of facility. So, excuse me, it's a whole larger issue, and it's more for a sociology class conversation. So I just want to talk about that they are a unique type of inmate that you could see. Usually, especially up here, not really. But sometimes when they're waiting for ICE, they might be held at a facility. All right. So we got, like I said, the big controversial ones out of the way. The only one we didn't talk about is females offenders, but we'll be talking about them in a little bit. Um, Wanted to talk about our large category of adults. And so this is the general catch-all group, any non-juvenile offender. These are the things I've already talked about and things I'm going to talk about. Anyone who's over the age of 18 or older, this is adults. This is what we're talking about. But according to evidence-based practice, so, science and data proven things, there are 8 steps to ensure the highest rate of success for rehabilitation into society. So again, reminder, the juvenile justice system is very focused on rehabilitation. Right now, here in the United States, we are more on that rehabilitation end of the swinging pendulum of our theories of punishment. Yes, there's a push towards being a little harder, but we're still in that rehabilitation. So when we look at adults, the evidence-based practice shows us that if we follow these 8 steps, if we hit all these things, then there's a higher rate of success for rehabilitation, for coming back into society after being in prison or being locked up or going through that process. And so obviously, first step is assess offender risks and needs. This is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go over the exact word for words, everything from the text on these 8 steps, but it's important to understand the 8 steps in a more straightforward, like everyday person conversation. So, assess offender risks and needs. You need to look at the individual and be able to see what is going to potentially lead them to commit this crime again. The risks, what are the risks to uh, repeat an offense? And what are the needs? What are the things that they need to survive, to avoid that, things of that nature. Second step is enhance offender motivation. This obviously is complicated because you need to know the offender, you need to know the individual fairly intimately to know what exactly will help them to become a better person. If they are an individual who really wants to become better so that they can spend time with their children, that's your motivation. So enhance offender motivation, whatever it is that makes that individual want to be the better person, want to return to society. You got to make that the most important thing. You got to really drive it home. Obviously, target interventions. If you're not sure what that means, target interventions are very specific and guided or targeted interventions. And an intervention can literally be just actively being there, or something akin to what you see on that old television show, Intervention. The idea is that you are engaging with a person at a key moment before something will cause a continual breakdown. So target interventions are making sure that before any potential can happen to commit a crime or recommit, you're there to make sure that it doesn't happen. So obviously, as a correctional officer, if that's the path you're going down, one of the things is to monitor the delivery of these interventions. The goal is to make sure that, it's not just, your one friend says, "Hey, I care about you." No, you're making sure that the way it's delivered is done appropriately and respectfully. No one's uh, negatively impacting the potential growth, that kind of thing, as well as, making sure that it is, I don't want to say routinely regular, but they are being done in the correct way at the correct time, things of that nature. Obviously, increased positive reinforcement. Again, that should be pretty straightforward, but if you know anything about positive and negative reinforcement does not mean it's a bad thing. It means you take something away. Positive reinforcement does not always mean it's good, but you give something. So, positive reinforcement, you want to influence that it is a good thing, so you increase this kind of supportive action when things are going well. It stimulates our brains to go, "Ooh, I like that serotonin. Let me do that again." Um, so engage in ongoing support via natural communities. This is important. Note the natural communities. So engage in ongoing support. The idea that just because they finish this one particular set of things and okay, they're ready to go back out. No, you make sure that there is ongoing support after they've finished. And so via natural communities, that's the piece. It's not that, oh, I'm going to make this one particular support group of these people and it exists because I made it happen. No, you find this kind of support, or you encourage this kind of support through a natural group. So maybe it's a church or a church group. Maybe it's a group meeting, like an AA meeting. I'm not saying that's the best example, but you take these formed groups or communities and you encourage that that's the ongoing support that's going to be continuing after your role is done. Obviously, you got to measure the processes, make sure everything is working as planned, look at the data, make sure everything is happening the way it is. And this is also not just that you're doing it well, but measuring the process that the inmate is going through for an adult. And that's going to help them. If they can see that progress, it's going to be, more supportive for them. And then the last thing is providing feedback. It's something that teachers are supposed to do and should do really well, and I'm not the greatest at it, and I'm trying to be better. But when you provide feedback to individuals, they have a better chance of growing in the best way possible. And so that's what this is for. Providing feedback through this process, obviously will help individuals and offenders, adult offenders, to recognize things and be able to successfully rejoin society and be a positive influence. So one unique population that we have to talk about is the elderly. They are a unique population considering that crime rates generally decrease with age. So the older someone gets, the less likely they're going to commit crime and things like that. But we do see that there is a decently large number of older inmates in prison. Um, Obviously, there is a niche part about sexual violence and pedophilia and things like that, but that is not what I'm talking about right here. The thing I'm talking about as far as elderly is concerned is that they are completing long sentences from their youth. Whether they were arrested when they were in their mid to late 20s or 30s, and they're in their 60s or 70s, completing a long sentence. That is a reality of the way we've put penalties and sentences within the criminal justice system. Um, so a lot of the elderly inmates are typically just long sentences. There's not too many elderly people that are going and robbing a bank and getting arrested and being put away for 20 years for robbery. Now, you see cases like that, but it's not the norm. most of the elderly that are in these situations have been in there for a very long time. So, with this, there are some direct things with this. So, first off, I just want to say that typically elderly inmates tend to have lower IQs, unstable employment histories, and higher rates of alcoholism. Um, and this data is simply supported partly because if they've been in there for you know, most of their life, yeah, they're not going to have a very good employment history and probably going to turn to alcohol for a lot of things and probably didn't do well in school and probably aren't very intelligent. And there's a lot of deeper issues connected to that. But what's important in regards to corrections and something that we really need to understand is that age impacts everyone's body. You can't avoid growing older unless you die young, but that's also not something that you want to wish for. Age impacts the body. And as you get older, your body doesn't work quite the same way anymore. And when we consider that we have inmates who are in prison for most of their life, we have to consider what the unique needs of elderly inmates are. And so, because of the impact on their body from age, there's an increased need for specialized health care, arthritis, heart conditions, blood pressure. Like, there needs to be specialized health care. And this is something that a couple students have talked about in other classes. Healthcare in the prison system is not great. Like, yeah, they have healthcare despite the fact that a lot of everyday citizens don't, but it's not a great improvement. They don't have the greatest care when it comes to health. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed. They need specialized healthcare that isn't typical. We also need to consider the specialized facilities designed for older bodies. One of the things that we tend to do, especially for a while that we were doing with prisons, is maximizing the amount of space that we have for inmates. So, bunk beds and things like that. But as you get older, you don't have the agility and strength to get on a bunk bed. When you use a shower or a bath or a toilet, even, you might need support bars. Like, these are things that aren't considered mobility enhancers, whether that's walkers, canes, or wheelchairs, which could be considered a weapon in a prison, but you might need some kind of support to move. Like, these are things that have not really been addressed, but as we have a continuingly graying, as they call it, an older inmate population, these are things that we have to see, and we're starting to try to figure out these things. And then one of the last, and I hate saying it this way, but it is financially draining on facilities. And what it means is that these individuals, as they get older and their bodies start to deteriorate and not work as well, they're unable to work the laborious jobs that are a requirement of incarceration. Because one way that facilities make money is through the labor that the inmates provide. And so if they can't work the laborious jobs, they're not making the money for the facility, but they're still taking up the money because they need the health care, because they're there. Now we have to install support bars and things. Like, all of a sudden, they are financially draining on a facility. And I am a person that does not view any individual as financially draining. Children are the worst. No, I'm kidding. But this is a real side effect, a real issue that we're seeing now more than ever in corrections, in the criminal justice system. Just because we've had so many long sentences and we're seeing people getting older and older, and this is changing the face. So we'll see how it continues in the future, but this is a unique population that was worth talking about. So we finally got to female offenders. Just want to start off with, oftentimes they're in facilities for nonviolent offenses, The data does show higher rates of violent offenses in males versus more nonviolent, less serious, and property offenses in female offenders. While it would be untrue to say that women do not commit violent offenses, but the data shows that the typically female offenders are in there for nonviolent offenses, not for violent offenses. But um, the facilities and the treatment requirements, much like we talked about, and that's why it's here, like we talked about with the elderly, how there are different requirements for them and things like that. One of the biggest differences that needs to be understood is pregnancy. Female inmates can get pregnant. Male inmates cannot. It's the biological nature of womanhood, of cisgendered womanhood. You can't avoid it. And so, because of that, facilities have to have a way of dealing with pregnancy. So, that varies, much like we see with juveniles. It varies by state to state and things like that. But there might be specific areas for pregnant inmates. There might be additional times or different cells and things of that nature. Might have better healthcare coverage specifically for the infant, for the fetus, as the mother is going through pregnancy. There's a lot of extra things to consider just based solely off of the physical difference in pregnancy. But some of the other things that are different from traditionally male only facilities, because statistically speaking, women are at a higher rate of abuse and I don't agree with this statement, but are more emotionally forward than males are. A lot of facilities for women have more of the psychology and therapy aspects than a male facility might. And that's because of the history of abuse and because of self-esteem and emotional issues that come with, unfortunately, womanhood. I mean, everyone suffers, I would argue, from some kind of emotional issue or self-esteem stuff. But that is a unique quality of female offenders as far as populations are concerned. So, as someone who qualifies under the mentally unwell, I have depression and anxiety, and I'm open about it. But the mentally unwell is a unique group, even among these unique types of inmates that we're talking about. And that's because the mentally unwell, I'm not just talking about people who are, like me mentally, they're depressed, anxious, things like that. We're talking people that would have benefited from an extended stay in a mental hospital. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. But these are people who, for all intents and purposes, should be closely monitored and being taken care of. So, in the 1960s, we had the deinstitutionalization movement and the unintended consequence of their actions. So, if you've ever seen or read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or you know anything about the history of mental health and mental health facilities that we've had over the years, the classic insane asylum and asylums for the mentally unwell, where the term came from for me, why I chose that one in particular. But truly, people with severe mental illness before the 1960s were institutionalized, which meant that they were placed in a facility where they were, for lack of a better word, locked up, and some were treated very inhumanely and not like people, whereas others were, taken care of and made sure that they are not a danger to themselves or others. but were safely confined within a facility. And so, because of the issues of how the mentally ill were being treated in some of these facilities, there was a huge deinstitutionalization movement, and it led to the shutdown of several insane asylums, mental asylums, things of that nature, um, which released several hundreds of mentally unwell individuals back into society, some of them to families that were ill equipped to take care of adults, of their adult children who could not care for themselves. Remember one night we talked about the LGBTQIA plus community, and I said homelessness is an issue. A lot of mentally unwell individuals would also become homeless. And there came a time, the unintended consequences of their actions, you're not going to be tortured by the doctors anymore. Yay, you're sent home where your family can't take care of you, and you start wandering off and you disappear, and then you're arrested. Yay, you're in jail now. There are the unintended consequence of the good work of preventing abuse to the mentally unwell led to them being arrested, and because there wasn't a mental institution they could be dropped off at, and sometimes they didn't have anywhere to go, they would be put in prison. And that in general, and that's why the third point on this is incarceration and mental health. Being incarcerated does negatively impact mental health. It's in a similar as war and things of that type. There is a PTSD regarding prison, especially non-white collar prison, which we'll talk about very briefly. But there is an impact on mental health. And so the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, in particular, our text brings this up. It led to the defunding of a lot of mental facilities and mental hospitals, with the idea that it should be supported by the community, not by the government. And so a lot of these facilities lost federal funding, and several were forced to close. And so then, as you know, people who needed this kind of help, there weren't facilities that were funded properly, so they might not have been able to do what they should be able to do. And there might have even been closures, so there might not have been a nearby one for these individuals. And so, again, the unintended consequence of all this was that a lot of mentally ill individuals are incarcerated. And we still see this today, that there's a decent number of homeless individuals who are just simply mentally ill. They are mentally unstable. We see this in schizophrenia. We see this in PTSD, specifically veterans returning from war. There is a connection between mental instability, PTSD, and homelessness. And that leads to incarceration, and it does not help that mental instability, that mental illness. It exacerbates it, it makes it worse. But so these are a particular group of inmates that are part of the system. So now to turn to a happier subject. Not that there can be a happier subject when talking about this, but career criminals. So what the heck is a career criminal? A career criminal is anyone that is at least 18 years old when their crime is committed that they are being currently incarcerated for. The crime is a crime of violence or of a controlled substance, and they have at least 2 prior convictions of a crime of violence or controlled substance as well. So the data from this textbook is from 2017, 2018. At that time, 3% of the annual caseload was of career criminals, despite the fact that they were more than 11% of the federal prison population. So they are more than 10%. So they're more than 1/10 of the total federal prison population. But they're less than 5% of the caseload annually. That's a problem. That shows that the large number of individuals who are incarcerated for it are partially in there longer because they are such a small part of the caseload of cases that get seen and dealt with. So we see a higher rate of people incarcerated than people that are getting their cases looked at because it takes longer. If you've taken, oh gosh, we talk about it in several different courses, but there is an issue of caseloads and more cases than there are caseloads currently. So this is a general issue. But career criminals themselves, these are, like I said, people who have committed at least 3 crimes of, crimes of violence or controlled substance. That's what we consider a career criminal. Drug trafficking, in general, as far as a career criminal, they are controlled substance crimes, but drug traffickers tend to be sentenced less severely. This is because obviously crimes of violence are what we consider severe crimes, serious crimes. These are things that have the long life sentences and things of that nature. But drug trafficking, typically you're looking at a couple years and then out. Their recidivism rates are fairly high. But that's because there's not really unfortunately to say this, there's not really a negative punishment for being a drug trafficker. You're in prison for a few years. Okay. Wasn't too bad. So there is an issue with that, with them being sentenced less severely, but at the same time, it does prevent prison overpopulating and things like that. It's a whole mess. It's complicated. But before we talk about our last group, when we talk about career criminals, are there other types of criminals? Because it seems weird that there's such a thing as a career criminal. So obviously, I did talk a little bit about sexual offenders earlier. Sexual offenders are I don't want to say, a unique group. They are difficult to work with both with community corrections and within correctional facilities because other people view them very negatively. The ever classic anyone who has sexually assaulted a child, it's like one of the unspoken rules that everyone knows about is that if you don't mess with kids in a prison setting, doesn't matter if you're a murderer, doesn't matter if you're in there because you know drug crime, theft, grand theft auto, doesn't matter. If you mess with kids, nobody likes you and there is already a target on your back. It's an unwritten thing, but it's there. And it partly goes back to that juvenile delinquency, and juveniles have suffered some kind of trauma before the age of 5 if they're involved in the criminal justice system. Like, these are people that know that your childhood is important, and if you messed with a kid, they're gonna take you down. And so, in particular, sexual offenders who are convicted of sexual assault against or any kind of sexual crime against a child, they are very divisive. It's hard to have them in general population because people don't like them. It's hard to get them back out into society because people don't like them. Also, sadly enough, the recidivism rate for sexual offenders is fairly high. There's a lot with it that make them a unique and difficult type of inmate that you see. But yeah, obviously, non-pedophilia sexual offenders in general are still, not really liked by others. If you mess with someone, you tend to get hurt. But yeah, the children one is the big thing that most people know about, even if you don't know much about the system itself. Um, but then there's another very unique population that we need to talk about that are criminal, and that's accidental criminals. And what we mean by accidental criminals, we mean uh, people that kind of stumbled into the situation. We tend to call these, if you've taken Intro to Criminal Justice or criminal law, um, you've heard the actus reus and the mens reus. These are individuals that lack the mens reus, but they have the actus reus. Uh, Essentially, they have the criminal act, but they're missing the intent to cause criminal behavior or mischief. So accidental criminals are people that just they broke the law, but they were not intending to do something maliciously or intending to break the law. It's just important to note that not every criminal is a criminal. As weird and paradoxical that sounds. And so our last big group that we're going to talk about is the gang members. Um, so we don't have a class for this, but if you do go on for more schooling in criminal justice, if you go to transfer to any other institution, there tends to be a class on organized crime. You talk so much about gangs and other things like that. So consider this your tiny, very small glimpse into what is organized crime as a whole subject. It is a very large subject. There's a lot to be talked about. If you've taken some of the other criminal justice courses, we've talked about organized crime in little bits and pieces. There's enough to make it a whole class. But for now, we're just going to be talking real quickly about gang members in particular within institutional facilities and in the corrections field. So there's a lot of incomplete data on gang members due to what we call policies regarding gang activity in facilities. Again, depending on municipality, location, things of that nature, there might be rules and regulations or laws that state, whether or not gang activity is recognized, or sometimes people just deny that there's gang activity when there is. Sometimes we see, I'm not saying this is a common thing, but corruption where gangs essentially run the facility. They have their own hierarchy, and the people that work within the facility either recognize that and work with it, or they are in danger themselves, even though they're the ones that are supposed to be in charge. It's a complicated matter. We're just going to leave it at that. But the big thing to note about gang members is oftentimes membership existed before they entered the facility. So a lot of the times when we talk about gangs within the criminal justice, not within the justice system, but within the correctional facilities and correctional system, these are people who are already part of gangs. Yes, people can join gangs when they are in prison, and that's kind of I don't want to say a meme, but it's a trope that you see in television and movies. Like, oh, I got to pick a prison gang. It's a thing, but typically these gangs are not just exclusively in prisons. Yes, there are some, but they're not exclusively in prison. They're usually related to something on the outside. So, with that in mind, so like I said, gang heavy facilities tend to have some kind of corruption issue. I do want to just point out real quickly something that the book puts forward that I do want to just kind of emphasize in its phrasing is not the best. So it pointed out that in 2006 there was a release of several, what was it, like 600,000 prisoners were released from prison in 2006 or 2007. And they emphasized that some of them were violent gang members. While, yes, that is highly possible and probable, it's important to note that just because some bad individuals were released from prison, we shouldn't view prison release as a negative thing. Um, there's a lot, it's a complicated issue. Um, but in general, when a gang member is released from prison, they are very likely to reoffend because they are part of that gang life. But the book talks about this, and I don't have it on the slide, but it's important to mention. There are these programs that some places do. The idea is that they're using rehabilitation. The way that you get out is you renounce your gang membership so that once you finish your time in prison, when you leave back out into the larger system itself, you are no longer part of this gang, and therefore you will no longer commit criminal activity. As I said, if we were in a organized crime class, I would dive into why that's not necessarily accurate and why that's complicated. But just note that reoffending members or reoffending offenders that are part of a gang, that rate is higher. So some of the big notable gangs that the book has little mini sections on, and I'm not going to go over those, but it's interesting to note. In an exam, you might see some of these gang names show up. Might help you to look more into them. But like I said, I just want to give you a few notable ones. So the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla Family. Please note, anyone who is not familiar with guerrilla as that spelling or that term in particular, guerrilla as it's spelled that way is not the animal. It is guerrilla warfare. It is individual, not super organized, grassroots kind of warfare or activity. So the Black Guerrilla Family is this kind of militant idea of a grassroots black family is what they're going for. It's not based off of gorilla the creature, but gorilla the concept of being grassroots, not as organized group. The Aryan Brotherhood, which is good old white skinheads, and then the ones that most people tend to know at some point because LA is super big and most people have heard of either the Bloods or the Crips or both. Some other ones that are notable that I didn't put down here are La Nuestra Familia, the Mexiconomy, the Texas Syndicate, and one that doesn't even get its own section in the book, but gets a little mention with the Bloods and the Crips is the 415s. It's the San Francisco area code 415. I want to note that almost all of these gangs have some kind of strong connection with prison and their origins in prison, and they're all kind of within, Texas, California, that kind of area. So just something to keep in mind. But I believe that wraps us up. Yeah, that wraps us up for this lecture. I hope you learned something. I know this was a little bit long and hopefully not too boring, but yeah, this was a different kind of topic. We need to talk about the different types of inmates that are out there. But if you have any questions as you're going through this, if you want to know more about any of those subjects, please reach out to me, let me know, and I'd be glad to share whatever additional information I can find for you. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'll see you all later.